Okay, guys, so today we are moving on to lesson 2 of Unit 8, which is completely taking place in England. So, lesson 1, of course, centered around, obviously multiple kingdoms, multiple characters. We talked about Elizabeth I, yes, of England, but then we talked about Philip II of Spain. Then we talked about just all of the issues taking place overall in Europe and how that leads to the witchcraft trials and then the 30 Years' War, specifically starting, yes, in the Holy Roman Empire or Germany, but of course morphing into many different kingdoms taking part in it in a bit of a power grab situation. But again, lesson 2 is strictly we're just talking about what's going on in England for a large portion of the 17th century. And if you'll remember from yesterday, England doesn't get involved in the 30 Years' War. They don't get they don't try to take sides or create some type of a power grab for themselves. And it's because they have their own issues going on that you will obviously find out about today. So, as we learned in lesson 1, Elizabeth I comes to the throne, and she is going to reign over England for 44 years. She is loved. She is going to be, her reign is known as the Golden Age of England. But her nickname is also the Virgin Queen because she never gets married and she never has children. So of course, whenever she dies, that's it. That's no more Tudor dynasty. She's the end of the line. In an ironic situation, Mary, Queen of Scots' son, James, is actually who comes to the throne. If you will remember, she actually has, from the videos, I didn't really talk about it much. I'll talk about it right quick now. But if you watched the videos, Elizabeth has her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, beheaded because she is implicated in assassination attempts on Elizabeth's life. She's implicated as a conspirator. So, and Elizabeth did have several assassination attempts placed on her. And, it was believed that the Spanish were, of course, trying to kill her by order, from Philip II. But that Mary, the Queen of Scots, Mary Stuart, who was a Catholic, was also involved because had Elizabeth died without an heir, Mary would have become queen. And then Spain, of course, would have had an ally, but more importantly, also an ally that was Catholic on the throne of England. So kind of, again, an ironic twist of history here. When Elizabeth dies without any children, Mary's son James comes to the throne. Now, the Stuarts had joined the Church of England, even though they were really, you could say, like closet Catholics in a lot of ways. So, yes, they had joined the Church of England, and clearly Mommy's beheading definitely like helped, usher that in, like, oh no, we're members of the Church of England now. And but Elizabeth also, if you remember, rewrote the Book of Common Prayer for the Church of England and made it very, very like broad, and she does this to try to avoid religious warfare. I mean, she does this because she's like, look, we are Protestant. You need to be members of the Church of England, but our Book of Common Prayer is broad enough that if, you should be able to make that work for you. And it's kind of like a loophole that she essentially creates. It's like, here's the Book of Common Prayer, like wink, wink. Because she doesn't want to see her country fall into the same situations that it was in under her dad, and then also, of course, under her sister, Bloody Mary. But when the Stuarts come to the throne with James I after Elizabeth dies, everybody kind of is aware of their, obviously, their background. But in addition to them, just religiously kind of being different, even though, again, not openly, but everybody knows. They have this mentality of we have been chosen by God. Like, this absolute ruler, absolute monarch mentality. But they take it to like a whole nother level. I mean, they don't believe that they should have to really work with Parliament, and they very much embrace like the one man show, because God put me here, so I shouldn't have to listen to anybody else thing. And this doesn't bode well. If England is used to having Elizabeth, she did well for them for 44 years. She's English, she's Protestant, but yet moderate. She works with Parliament, she's, and so to have these, kind of closeted Catholic, Scottish, absolute monarch, divine right of king, egomaniac people come in and take the throne, which by their birthright, they were the next in line. Like, it still just is a recipe for disaster. So one thing that started happening in England that helps kind of push England towards, obviously, war, that's what's coming. That's what I'm foreshadowing here, is the fact that you have a whole group of English Protestants that see militant Calvinism in the Holy Roman Empire during the 30 Years' War and the lead up to the 30 Years' War, and they agree with it. They agree that the Church of England needs to become more radicalized. They believe that it's too moderate. The Book of Common Prayer needs to be tightened up so that it isn't this kind of a loophole Book of Common Prayer. And again, they want everything to become more radical in terms of Protestantism. These people are your Puritans, everybody. I mean, that's the Puritans. They it's kind of funny. Yes, as American students, we always think of Puritans, well, they got kicked out for religious persecution. And that's true, but they got kicked out for religious persecution because they were so radical. I mean, like Robin Williams said it best, like Puritans, people so uptight, even the English kick them out. I mean, to this day, like one of the best Robin Williams lines. But so England, has this group, right? This radicalized group of Protestants starting to gain ground and popularity. You have members of the House of Commons that are Puritans that, again, are starting to really have some influence. And so at the time that they are pushing for more Protestant tightening up of the Book of Common Prayer, you have the Stuart dynasty that is now the monarchs of England, who are closet Catholics and, of course, are going to defend the Book of Common Prayer of the Church of England wholeheartedly, because that allows them to maintain their closet Catholicism. And eventually this is gonna boil over. So the Stuart line is actually, when it comes to names, kind of easy to remember. It's just James, Charles, James. And another thing that they make it easy, is that they're all the first or second. So James the first, Charles the first, Charles the second, James the second. So James, Charles, James, and then it's just 1, 1, 2, 2. So I always appreciated the Stuarts as a history student in that respect. Thank you for making the names and the Roman numerals a little easy for everybody. But so James the First, again, is the first Stuart king. He's going to die before any thing kind of really comes to a head. But under Charles the First, it comes to a head. Just like his dad, he comes to the throne believing in divine right, believing that he doesn't have to, really listen to Parliament. And he really only convenes Parliament because he knows like that, he has to do it every now and then to kind of like appease the people and, that kind of thing. But he pretty much just ignores them. And so Parliament passes in 1628 what becomes known as the Petition of Right. This is, okay, you've got to listen to us. And it's supposed to limit his power. Like Parliament saying, we're going to limit your power until you start to listen to us. Well, he just totally ignores it. And in addition to ignoring the Petition of Right and furthering creating like an even wider divide between he and his representative body, he also starts to try to impose more ritual within the Church of England. And of course, he's doing this because he's a closet Catholic. And so, so at a time when you have Puritans wanting the Church of England to become way more Protestant and simplified, you have the actual monarch trying to impose more ritual onto it. So, no shocker here. By 1642, England is in the midst of a civil war. Okay, the supporters of the king were known as the Cavaliers. The supporters of Parliament, in terms of those that were, you had some parliamentary members that were Cavaliers, but the parliamentary forces going against King Charles were called Roundheads. A civil war, of course, just kind of review of basic social studies vocabulary here. A civil war, of course, is a war fought within a nation's borders amongst its own people. All right, so this is a war strictly between the English. There are no foreign enemies. This is an issue amongst themselves. So civil war breaks out. The Roundheads and the parliamentary forces are going to win the English Civil War, largely due to a man named Oliver Cromwell, who's the portrait here on this slide. He is not a nobleman. He's actually like the son of a farmer and a farmer himself. But he has just kind of this God-given ability to be an incredible military strategist. Like he sees the battlefield and he's very like progressive, and he's also very creative and just this kind of brilliant military strategist. So he works his way up, becomes the commander of what is known as the New Model Army for the Roundheads, and they win, okay, with him at the helm. So once they win, they actually take any member of Parliament that was a Cavalier and kicks him out. Like they kick him out of Parliament. And if you weren't with us, then you're against us. And what's left becomes known as the Rump Parliament. But they really they take it a step further and have Charles I executed publicly on January 30th, 1649. Now, we have had tons of deaths that we have talked about in this class, right? Like it's history. So it's all about, who was the big leader or who was the big person within this story, what happens to them. We've seen queens get their heads chopped off with Henry VIII. I mean, and we have had kings die in battle, and intrigue and things like that. But this is the first time in European history that a king had ever been publicly beheaded. So this is one of those like shockwave moments. Okay, this is one of those like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that the English people have publicly chopped the head off of their king. Like big moment in history, and it horrified not just royal families and but even commoners and nobles of all of Europe. People were just like outraged. They were like, England's done lost their mind. But the thing that's kind of, again, the thing that's ironic about the end and the outcome of the English Civil War is that the Roundheads really place all of their trust and loyalty into Oliver Cromwell. They're like, oh, he's a commoner, and we're gonna shake things up, and we're gonna actually they end up abolishing the House of Lords, because that they're the House of Lords are nobles, and they abolish the monarchy, and they're like, we're going to be a commonwealth. We're going to be a republic with no nobility. no royal family. And of course, this is just like, this is crazy. I mean, this is 1688, people. There's no such thing as like Republican or Democratic governments in Europe at this time. Remember, this is the time of absolute monarchs and nobility and royal families and birthrights and divine right of kings. And they have killed their king publicly, abolished the House of Lords, and said, no kings, we're going to be a republic. This is huge. And again, they totally believed, Cromwell is leading the way. But in a quite ironic, funny turn of events, he decides that things get too complicated for him, and he doesn't want to work with the remaining parliamentary members in the House of Commons. And so he actually says, out with you guys too, and sets up a military dictatorship until his death in 1658. Now, brilliantly, he names himself Lord Protector. I mean, if there was ever a name that you're going to pick that sounds good, even though you're a military dictator, props to picking Lord Protector. But yeah, I mean, they kill a king to eventually just have a military dictator. And again, those of you online, please don't skip these videos. We watch them in class, and so I expect you to watch them at home too. And this is a great overview of, kind of some key points throughout the English Civil War. And at the end of it, though, he talks about how there is a primary source that is quoted in talking about how when Charles I was publicly executed and the axe came down on his head, that the whole crowd actually like groaned, like, oh, instead of cheering. I mean, you would think that if the English people were really truly behind, abolishing the monarchy and off with the king's head, that they'd be like, woo, whenever that happens. But that's not what happens. And that just goes to show you that the English people really, if you get down to brass tacks, probably didn't really want to see the monarchy abolished. Like the Puritans and Cromwell took it way further than anybody would have ever expected them to take it. And, and clearly with Cromwell then becoming a military dictator, things get really out of hand. So when he dies in 1658, it's not that surprising that the English restore the monarchy. So in 1660, Charles II, Charles I's son, is asked to be king again, and they reinstate the House of Lords and Parliament and say, listen, we need to go back to square one, where we have a parliament and we have a monarch that work together, and like, we've got to make this work, guys. Like that was better than what ended up happening with the Civil War and Cromwell. But the next thing is, I've had students ask me already this morning, like, why would you reinstate the same family? Right? Like, why not pick a different noble family if you have the power and ability to do so? Well, because there were still most people that believed that, okay, it's a birthright thing, right? They're still the royal family by birthright. And Charles II was also really popular. Like, he's actually nicknamed the Merry Monarch because everybody liked him. He was a real charismatic, real like nice guy, life of the party. So they were kind of like, okay, we know Charles is a Stuart, but at the same time, like, everybody likes the guy. So, we'll forgive you of being a Stuart because you're cool, is essentially what the mentality was. And even though Charles II was still a Stuart, still believed in divine right, and very much pushed his own ideas, and was a closet Catholic, just like all the other Stuarts, it's like it was accepted because he was popular and well liked. Now, his little brother, James, on the other hand, was like the unpopular, weird little brother, right? Like, so you have the older brother that's all popular, charismatic, everybody likes him. And then James is like the little brother that's unpopular that nobody likes. because James didn't have the big personality, and he didn't hide the fact that he was a Catholic. He was openly Catholic. So, I mean, they were like, okay, listen, at least the rest of your family tried to be political and hide it. Like, come on. James wasn't going to do it. He was like, no, like, I'm Catholic. I don't make any bones about it. But James wasn't king, right? Charles II was king. So they were like, well, we've got Charles. We like him. No big deal. Charles II is going to die without an heir, which means that unpopular, openly Catholic little brother James becomes King of England. Okay? But still, not everybody freaks out, right? Because here's the situation. James had married an English bride who was Protestant. And so when that happens, when you have like a split in the marriage of religious beliefs at this time, it was the tradition held that if you had girls, they would follow the path religiously of the mom. And if you had boys, they would follow the path religiously of the dad. So in this case, like the girls are Protestant, the boys would be Catholic. Well, James had 2 daughters. Problem solved, right? Like, okay, we'll just wait James out. He had 2 daughters. The eldest was Mary. The youngest was Anne. I know they're not very creative with names in history. I'm sorry. You're like, God, more Annes and more Marys. But yes. Okay. So the eldest was Mary. Youngest was Anne. Protestant. Again, even mom was English too. So it was like, okay, his wife is English. She's Protestant. She's raised the girls to be Protestant. We're good. He'll die. Mary will become queen. We just got to wait him out. His first wife dies. He remarries. And they have a bouncing baby boy. And if you're paying attention, that means he's going to be raised Catholic. So now we have the potential to have an openly Catholic dynasty ruling England, and that we cannot have in England, right? Like, so Parliament is like, okay, oh my God, nope, this is not okay. We were good with waiting him out until Mary could take the throne, but now that we have this bouncing baby boy, like, no, this cannot happen. The bouncing baby boy is James Francis Edward Stuart, the Bonnie Prince. So he's known as the Bonnie Prince because, as you can see in his portrait there, he's a pretty boy. Okay. And that's what he was. He had a very kind of like almost porcelain doll, girly look about him. And so, of course, in Scotland, if you are a bonny lass, you are a pretty girl. And so his nickname was seriously like the Pretty Prince, the Bonnie Prince. So, anyways, if you're kind of wondering, like, who is this person on the screen? That's who that is. That is James II's son. That really his birth creates what becomes known as the Glorious Revolution. So Parliament sends secret letters to the eldest daughter of James II, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange. William of Orange was Dutch, okay, and he was pretty wealthy in his own right, and they were sending letters, secret letters to them saying, listen, if y'all will gather an army and sail for England, we will meet you. We will meet you with an army, and we will march to London together to dethrone your dad, your father-in-law, and your dad. Well, even if Mary maybe had some, feelings about betraying her dad, at the end of the day, like, it's her husband's decision kind of to make this. And I mean, yeah, I have the potential to be the, co-monarch of England. Yes, please sign me up. So here come William and Mary with their forces. They're going to land at Torbay in November of 1688, where, yes, as soon as they start to march inland, a parliamentary army is there to meet them. Of course, James catches, he figures all this out, catches wind that this is all happening, figures this out, raises his own army, and marches out to, of course, meet them, right? Like, defend his throne. And this is where, if there was ever anybody that lost a popularity contest, it's James II. In the middle of the night one night, most of his army, like a large portion of James's army, and his younger daughter Anne and her husband defect to William and Mary's side. So now, like, not only has his army betrayed him, his own younger daughter has now also betrayed him. So, of course, at this point, the guy is obviously screwed and has no choice but to just flee. He has to leave. I mean, like, you're done for. Stick a fork, you're done. Your army has betrayed you. Your parliament has betrayed you. Your own two daughters have now betrayed you. Like, I think the writing's on the wall. So he and his wife and their son flee, and they'll live out the rest of their lives going between the court of Louis XIV in France, who was Catholic and took them in, and Rome, of course, because the Catholic Church also protected them and took them in. So yeah, they basically live the rest of their lives, juggling the courts of the Pope and then Louis XIV in France. And William and Mary, of course, are then there to take the throne. But with some serious conditions, because think about it. Who really holds the power right now? William and Mary or Parliament? The answer in your brain should be Parliament. Parliament's the one holding the cards, and they played them beautifully. Okay. So they said, okay, we've won. Like your dad has fled and left the throne open. And yes, we do. We want you to be king and queen of England, you, William and Mary. However, you're going to need to sign this right quick, which is the English Bill of Rights. Okay. The English Bill of Rights essentially shifts all of the major monarchical powers, aka like the king and queen's powers, to Parliament. So everybody always asks me, I have students consistently ask me, like, why doesn't the Queen of England have more power? Like, why is she just this figurehead that like waves and, like shows up at social events? Why doesn't she really hold more power? Here you go. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 is really why. Okay. Parliament now becomes the lawmaking entity. They are the ones that levy the taxes. An army can't even be raised without Parliament's consent. Citizens can now individually bear arms. You can't have a judicial court controlled by a king or queen. You have to have a jury trial. And if all of this sounds familiar, it should, because our Bill of Rights is very similar to the English Bill of Rights. Of course, you have to remember, our founding fathers were English. And because of the Glorious Revolution and Parliament's, set up and the English Bill of Rights, like it's really a pretty incredibly sound governing body and governing situation. And so, yes, our founding fathers were frustrated because they were being exploited as a colony. But at the same time, if you look at the government of England, like, hey, if it ain't broke. And so a lot of our stuff really is influenced by England's Bill of Rights. And again, how their government is set up through Parliament. But this one move destroys absolute monarchy in England forever and shifts power really and authority to Parliament, not the crown. And it'll stay that way. So, why is it called the Glorious Revolution? Well, think about it. There was no fighting. Well, there wasn't one drop of blood shed in this whole revolution. So that's why it's called the Glorious Revolution. And that's as far as we are getting today in class. Tomorrow at the beginning of class, we will actually watch this video as a nice kind of refresher. And then we will finish lesson 2 and take our formative assessment, where I'm actually pushing it up a day. I didn't realize that we would get this far through lesson 2 today, so which is good. So we will start lesson 3 now on Friday instead of Monday. So we're actually a day ahead. Yay. But I will see you guys tomorrow. And until then, have a good one.